I would invite you to take a look at Exodus chapter 19. And even though Exodus has many more chapters, this will probably be our last study in this overview of the book of Exodus, because the rest of it certainly has value, but it is mostly kind of tedious. It's about the tabernacle and about all the other laws in addition to the Ten Commandments, and so we won't take the time to go through that. And so next Sunday, I believe we'll be starting on a new overview, and that will be the book of Acts. We've gone from Genesis to Matthew to Exodus, and now we're going to go to the book of Acts. As we look at the beginning of chapter 19 in the book of Exodus, we have not gone in detail past the provision of manna and quail miraculously, as the people complained about worrying about starving to death under Moses' inept leadership, they think. And then we see in chapter 17, they're complaining about being thirsty. They're worried that there's no rock, that there's no water. Now, last week we talked about they having bitter water, and they were fussing about that. And now they don't see any water. And so God provided by giving Moses instructions to tap the rock, and the water would come out, and in fact he did. Now, we'll remember, and we won't talk about it obviously since we're finishing up Exodus, and we don't hear the end of the story. But the next time Moses tries to get water out of a rock, he thought, well, I struck it last time and that worked, so I'll strike it this time. But that was explicitly not what God required. And so God said, okay, if you're going to be disobedient, it sounds harsh, but there's a sermon in that I'm not going to preach today. But he only saw the promised land from the height of Mount Pisgah and was not allowed to go in. And frankly, if I was Moses, I think I'd be like, yeah, just let's just finish this thing, and I'll die right here. Then we have the first recorded attack on the Hebrew people from the Amalekites. And they were a persistent aggravation throughout the Old Testament to the Hebrew people. And this was the story, another great sermon, of God saying, Moses, as long as you hold that rod above the people, the same rod that you used with the Red Sea, then your people will prevail in battle, so keep your hands lifted up. And so they were prevailing in battle, and Moses just frankly got physically tired, even though he was a pretty studly guy. He could put up with a lot. And so Aaron came up, and they said, well, you keep your arms up, sit down here, we'll hold your arms up. We'll take turns holding your arms up. So wonderful sermon about encouragement, about the need for others, about God's provision. And that would have been a great sermon, but we'll move on to my average sermon. Then we see father-in-law Jethro. And just as kind of an interesting historical snippet, you remember when we talked about that bizarre incident where Moses was walking along and God said, I'm going to kill you? And so Zipporah, the wife, said, it's because you didn't circumcise your own kids, and here you are going to lead this whole nation to obey God's laws and to trust you. So that's not going to work. And so there was that. And then we don't hear much about Zipporah at all until we get to chapter 18. Now we're several months in, and she shows up with her father, Jethro, who's the priest of Midian, a priest of what we're not absolutely sure, but he was still an ally of Moses. And he gives Moses good advice. You're shouldering all of this responsibility. You need to divvy this up and stop letting everybody and their brother come up to you and tell you their problems. So you appoint some people, and the people can go to them with their legal and ceremonial issues and complaints. And then if there's something big, come to me. Just like our current court system, you have the lower courts, then the appellate courts, and the final court. So shout out to father-in-laws everywhere. Now, let's go down to chapter 19. In the 3rd month, from the very day the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came to the Sinai wilderness. They traveled from Rephidim, came to the Sinai wilderness, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Moses went up the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, "This is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant," notice the if, "you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation." So there's an indication here about the worldwide concern of God for the redemption and salvation of all people, because he wants this nation to be an example to all people and to have a priestly capacity to all people. After Moses came back down the mountain, he summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. Then all the people responded together, "That we will do all that the Lord has spoken." Yes, truly laughable. But in the moment of inspiration, we're ready to do that, aren't we? Right? We're ready to do that. Now, not too long ago, they were aching to go back to Egypt where life was grand. And now they're saying, whatever Moses says, we believe it, we'll do it. Now, again, we're not really clearly convinced from the account that the Hebrew people are totally sold on this one God, most powerful God thing. And we see them slipping from time to time. The Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear when I speak with you and will always believe you." Moses reported the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord told Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today, and tomorrow they must wash their clothes and be prepared by the 3rd day, for on the 3rd day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." And then God instructs Moses this way in verse 12. "Put boundaries for the people all around the mountain, and say, be careful that you don't go up on the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain must be put to death. No hand may touch him. Instead, he will be stoned or shot with arrows and not live, whether animal or human. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, then they may go up to the mountain." Now, this is perhaps a symbolic precursor when the Lord talks about establishing boundaries. And the Lord also says, it's not for you to come to me, it is for me to come to you. And I come to you in my holiness, and I want you to do the best to come to me in your holiness, although we know, of course, that our righteousness is not sufficient to enter into God's presence. Then Moses came down from the mountain to the people and consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. He said to the people, "Be prepared by the 3rd day. Don't have any sexual relations with women." On the 3rd day, when morning came, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and very loud trumpet sounds. So all the people in the camp shuddered. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord came down on it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. And this was again in the sight and hearing of the Hebrew people, so that they would know that God is making direct communication with Moses as his appointed servant and representative. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai at the top of the mountain. Then the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and he went up. And the Lord directed Moses to go down and warn the people not to break through to see the Lord, otherwise many of them will die. Do you know folks who are trying to break through on their own wit, their own merit, their own theology, and trying to get to God? We do not go to God. God comes to us. Jesus came to us. Now, what is it that we can do then other than just stand passively? And that is, we open the door and we accept God's invitation to be present with us. So there's no crawling to God, there's no stairway to God, there's no ladder to God, there's no incantation that brings God to us. It is all God's purpose, which means that we tend to think of the Old Testament as works and sacrifices and the New Testament as grace, but there is much, much, much grace of God in the Old Testament. In fact, when we see God's miracles, when we see his what seems to be punishment, what is punishment, we tend to think of that as that wrathful, angry God that's way different than the New Testament God that we read about. And just like we talked about, if you recall, in our study of Revelation, with all of those bad things that happen, when we talk about the early chapters of Exodus with the plagues, God is, in a loving way that we can't fully comprehend, showing his power so that the people can be convinced that he, in fact, is the one true God. And having given them the opportunity to know who God is, because God himself has revealed himself in these ways, given them the opportunity to repent, to follow him, and to live, as another Joel says, your best life now. Moses responded to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai since you warned us, put a boundary around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord replied to him, go down and come back with Aaron, but the priests and the people must not break through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out in anger against him. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And then we have a recitation, one of a couple of places where in the Old Testament we see a recitation of the Ten Commandments. And I would remind us, of course, and we probably know this if we think about it, the Ten Commandments are endorsed and quoted by Jesus in the New Testament. At least 9 of the Ten Commandments are quoted word for word in the New Testament. And so there are those who would say, well, it's all grace, 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 it's all freedom, it's all that kind of thing. And so the Ten Commandments have a historical purpose, and they're kind of interesting, but they're no longer necessary in living in the freedom in Christ, and simply is not true. Well, let's talk a little bit about the principle of having rules in one's life. Then we'll talk about fear, we'll talk about love, and we'll talk about grace before we do a recitation of the Ten Commandments. And I'm not going to engage in a 12-week sermon series on the Ten Commandments. You've read them. There are a lot of people that can teach on them, and I may one of these days, but again, as an overview, we're not going to do that specifically today. Has our social and cultural and intellectual evolution of man resulted in a society where man can self-regulate? No. I just wrote an article asking the question, if we did not have law enforcement, would we create law enforcement after some period of time? Say, okay, because there are those out there, you know, we talk about defunding, but there's also a lot of abolitionists. We don't need the police. So, okay, let's get rid of them and let's see what happens. And I think we would find that the only people who could be able to enforce order would be those who are the strongest or those who are the richest. And so we would maybe decide that, you know, we probably ought to just have some people endowed by the government with the right to compel behavior, whether it's in the affirmative or in the negative. And then for those who want to disarm the police, I think we would come to the conclusion that Great Britain is finally coming around to, they're arming more and more of their police officers. That we would need to give officers the tools of coercion so that when people are out of boundaries or when they refuse to comply with the law of social order, that they have these tools. And so it's apparent, I think we can follow a logical progression to come to an understanding that we need rules. Some of you remember that a while back Patty gave us a really nice lesson with visual aids about plumb lines and leveling devices. And we don't know what's crooked until we put a straight edge against it. We don't know what's off-center unless we put a level. We don't know whether something is whether a foundation is being built up accurately unless we have a plumb line. So having a standard helps us know when we're off the standard. If we rely on what some people say, oh, well, you know, just rely on your conscience, follow your heart, that doesn't work. Read Lord of the Flies if you haven't lately. There's been some controversy about a couple of states that want to put the Ten Commandments in the public schools on the walls. And here's my position on that. If we want to do that to show the historical foundation of our system of laws, then I think that's very valid. If we're trying to impose some religion on students, that is dangerous. It's not what we have decided to do constitutionally, and if you're going to start posting things that demand some type of religious allegiance, then we're going to see some Quran verses being posted and some Church of Satan verses being posted. But it's very much so a historically legitimate claim that the Ten Commandments are a basis for American law and jurisprudence, both civilly and criminally. Let me give you a little criminal justice lesson here. Can't help it. Used to be that if we're talking about actually Old Testament, Roman, and English law, that everything was a civil case. If you robbed me, it was, okay, I need to recover from you because of the damage that you did to me. And then, let's take England, for example. The king says, yeah, we'll do that because we don't want people just taking individual vengeance, and so we're going to make you go through a court process so that we have some objective persons and some limits. That's what, as I've probably told you before, this the law that said an eye for an eye, that was a limitation. Let's be proportional. If somebody pokes out your eye, you don't get to rape their spouse and burn their village. Just an eye for an eye. And so not only that, but the kings were like, yeah, you need to go into my court and get that settled. And by the way, you'll have to pay some court costs, add to the public treasury. And then the king decided this is a simplified thing. I try to make things simple because I teach cops. And the king finally said, you know, you're my subject. And so if somebody does something harmful to my subject, it's really you're doing it to me. And so now I'm going to let the king or the crown file charges because of that. So the civil system of Jones versus Smith stayed intact, but then State versus Smith also evolved. And so you can be charged with a crime, and you can also be sued for the damages from that crime. And that comes out of the 630-something laws in addition to the 10 Commandments that we find in the Bible. Now, there was a legal code that probably predates the 10 Commandments, and that's the Code of Hammurabi you may have heard about, an ancient Syrian code. And but there are a lot of differences between the Code of Hammurabi and the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments was a holistic, theological, spiritual kind of thing. And the Code of Hammurabi was not. It was strictly legal. So justice also requires accountability. I talked about this idea of fairness not too long ago. One of the first things that kids that you hear coming out of kids' mouths is, "That's not fair. He got something I didn't get. He got more of something that I didn't get." You never hear, "Oh, he didn't get as much as I got. Let me share with him." Very rarely. So we have a natural bent that requires justice, and it requires accountability. Now, what about the fear aspect? I want to move to after the 10 Commandments have been established before the people. In verse 18 of chapter 20, the previous verses being a recitation of the commandments. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain surrounded by smoke. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. "You speak to us, and we will listen," they said to Moses, "but don't let God speak to us, or we will die." Moses responded to the people, "Don't be afraid, for God has come to test you so that you will fear him and will not sin." And the people remained standing at a distance as Moses approached the total darkness where God was. Now, I know that not all of you had good, healthy, balanced parents. I did for the most part. I had a healthy fear of my mother and my father. Now, my dad was very present, but he did work hard, and so mom was around more often in terms of actual clock hours of exposure. And as I've communicated with you before, mom's justice was very swift and very sharp. I didn't get spanked very often. In fact, I only had one formal spanking. I had to stand in line with my siblings. We had a very simple, ugly house, but for some reason, Mom had 3 decorative cutting boards hanging on the wall. I didn't know those were cutting boards until I went to college. I thought they were paddles, one for each kid. I got the smallest paddle. But she was a slapper, and I deserved every one of them. I haven't been harmed by them. I'm not going to advocate corporal punishment, but you didn't have to do it very often for me to learn the lesson. And again, I probably shared with you, if Mom was so angry that she knew that she was going to go overboard, she said, "Wait till your dad gets home." And I was like, thank goodness, because Dad would just talk to me. And you know, we agreed that I would tell Mom, "Oh, was terrible what Dad did." But I did fear my father. I did fear my father. And so I obeyed not only what they said, but I also obeyed what I knew they would say. And I did self-regulate, partly out of fear, but also partly out of respect. I had 2 difficult older siblings, and I saw what their issues, what pain that caused to my mom and dad. I did not want to do that. And so out of love and respect, I was a pretty well-behaved kid. And was rewarded for it. So it wasn't like I was fighting an uphill battle or was really inclined to be bent the wrong way. But fear has a place. Respect has a place. We fear God because He demonstrates His power. And because of that fear and respect, we say, okay, I'm going to be a trusting learner. We can learn the consequences of wrong behavior in one of three ways. We can see what God has to say about it, and we say, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. But if I believe what God says, I'll just obey, and I won't dip my toe into the waters of sin. Now, I'm not saying I didn't, but that's the best way to learn, is by trusting what God says. God reveals a lot to us. People all the time are asking, how do I know about God's will for this job or this move or this relationship? And I heard actually it was Alistair Begg that I was listening to yesterday. He said, if you follow the general will of God and are obedient to what you know to be true based on God's revelation, then those other questions of specific will kind of answer themselves. And God wants your heart. And you may ask, well, should I be a mechanic, or should I be a waiter, or should I be a professor or a fireman? And I don't know how much God really cares about those specific vocational decisions. But He does care how you're going to do what you end up doing, so that your work glorifies God, and whatever your hands find to do, do it as unto the Lord. And we do that out of fear and respect. So we learn by trusting. We also learn a secondary way by watching other people do stupid things and saying to ourselves, I'm not going to do that. Now, we can do that in the positive way, saying, who are the people that seem to get along with people? And who are the people that others seem to admire and respect? I'll emulate that person. Or we can say, this is a person who is suffering the natural consequences of following a moment of pleasure and suffering in a lifetime of regret. So we have those examples to look at. And then we have the worst way to learn, and that is the primary experience of being that disobedient person and suffering the consequences. Now, God is a redemptive God. You are a new creature when you are saved. But it's like the old story of the boy whose dad was trying to control his anger, and you've heard this story. The dad said, I tell you what, okay, every time you have a fit, I want you to go down and drive a nail into that post and kind of work off his energy a little bit. So he started doing that, and finally the little boy learned the lesson, and he decided, okay, that's too much trouble. I'm not going to make that walk and drive that nail anymore. And then the dad said, now you need to go pull out each one of those nails and see the scars. So we can learn that way, and that's not the recommended way. It's really hard to teach people, and I'm not picking on teenagers, but it's really hard to teach young people the consequences of stupid things, because they don't have any concept of the future, plus they're all 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And it's just partly a developmental thing. Now, I'm not one of these people that says, your brain doesn't even develop until it's 25. Well, that's garbage. There's a general principle that a lot of these things don't get fulfilled until you're, along with a variety of experiences. Of course, we deny young people a variety of experiences in positive ways these days. When you have 19-year-olds flying helicopters in combat, I think that disproves the theory that every 24-year-old is still an idiot. Yeah. So I expect a lot out of young people. But still, it's hard for them to do that first learning from trusting and obeying, and sometimes hard to see the consequences of other people doing stupid things and so they have to do it themselves. We just pray that that they don't do something that they will have regrets for the rest of their life. I was watching years ago a 100-year-old man being interviewed by Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. And Johnny asked the question that we ask all 100-year-olds, to what do you credit your long life? And he said, a well-spent youth. And as a youth at the time, I thought that was a really great answer. And maybe that's the key to my longevity, I don't know. But within that fear, respect, recognition of authority is the boundaries that give us security. And you know, parents, sometimes kids are not easy, and sometimes kids are not neurotypical and don't respond the way that we would hope that they would. But in general, we know some parents that are like, go your own way. And we tragically have so many parents that say, well, I'm not going to drag my kid to church. I'm going to let them make their own decision. Not wise. Kids need boundaries. And when little children especially, maybe you raise your kid this way and maybe they're fine. But when I'm in a restaurant, and I try not to judge parents, you don't know what's going on. But when I see a 2-year-old being asked, do you want some vegetables or do you want ice cream? I don't remember having those choices to make when I was a kid. Because that's a burden on a child to be making those decisions. They need the security of knowing, here's this adult that cares for me, and they are feeding me something that I know must be in my best interest. And so because I know they love me, and I know I love them, and I trust them, they've never done me wrong, I'll eat the green stuff. Now, I admit I rebelled when I was about 7. And yet, is there anybody else that really enjoys something that they didn't like as a kid? Yeah, I thought ham and beans that was the worst meal in the world. So I just ate a whole bunch of cornbread with butter and jelly on it. But I'm kind of a fan of ham and beans. So again, should have trusted their judgment way back then. So it's a sign of love when a parent creates a boundary. Now, obviously, we don't want to be so strict that everything you do comes with a caution. Oh, don't do that. Oh, be careful. I tell you, I was proud of Kim's kids. They came to pizza with us last Tuesday, and I said, we'll give you a ride home. And they said, oh, no, we'll walk. And you don't see kids walking anymore. Everybody's so afraid they're going to get run over and kidnapped and smoke meth on the way home, and so it was really of course Cheryl walked with him. I was worried about her.
They were fun.
But I just think that's great. You don't see kids riding bicycles all over town like you did when I was a kid. Of course, I had the advantage of a mom who worked midnights, and she was pretty much semi-conscious by the time I woke up in the morning, particularly in the summers. And I would say, Mom, can Ronnie and I ride into town? We live 5 miles out of town on Gravel Road. And she'd moan, and I'd say, okay, thanks. And usually got home before she woke up, so it all worked out. But I knew what the boundaries were. I knew to be home by supper. I knew to be polite. I knew to do the chores that needed to be done. And there's comfort in that. That's an evidence of love. It's an evidence of protection. It's preventive. It's part of God's grace. Now let me very quickly run down these commandments. And if you'll remember, an easy way, why 10? Why not just 1 or 2? Well, Jesus said this in answer to the question of the most important commandment: love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy mind, all thy strength. And number 2 was, love your neighbor as yourself. The first reflects the first 5 commandments. The second reflects the last 5 commandments. And so when Hebrew children were learning this, it was very easy for them to have a little mnemonic device attached to their hands. God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods beside me. Do not make an idol for yourself, either in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or on the waters underneath the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for their father's iniquity to the 3rd and 4th generation. That's a sermon. But showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. I wonder if there's somebody in my lineage long time ago that was faithful to the Lord, and as a result of that, thousands of years later, I was blessed and protected. And I hope that my life of obedience, to the extent that it is a blessing to generations and to others. So, some people get hung up on, the father's iniquity is going to be suffered by the 3rd and 4th generations, and some of you 3rd and 4th and 2nd generations kids know that suffering isn't an imputation of their sin on you, but the sin of their failed life is part of you and something that you've had to overcome. But you have the opportunity to be a blessing to generations. Don't misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. The Lord your God, you must not do any work. You, your sons or daughters, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. We can get tangled up on some real legalism on that teaching. And then the 5th commandment that relates to how I relate to God, whereas the last 5 commandments relate to how I relate to other people. It seems like honor your father and mother would be something that fits in with the relating to other people in the other category. But who are God's representatives to children? It is the parents. And so to obey the parents is obedient to God. So this essentially is an extended reverence for God. Now, again, I know not everybody in here had godly parents. My paternal grandfather was a despicable man, and yet my mom would let him come and visit from time to time because she wanted to honor the fact that he was a father. And although I don't have any reason to have any respect for him, he did beget, and here I am. So thankful for that. Mom would let him visit until he started getting into the rubbing alcohol and aftershave, and then it was time to send him on his way. And my maternal grandmother didn't have a whole lot to offer. She just kind of slumped around. She was beaten down by life and beaten down by her first husband, and had some real issues. She was a nice lady, but it was just not much quality interaction. But Mom and Dad took care of her for most of her life. They either lived with us or they got a trailer and they lived next door. So that was a command that was given despite what one might be inclined to do, because it was the law of God and it was designed to be a blessing. So then, 6, do not murder. do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony against your neighbor, and don't covet your neighbor's house. Can you think of any problem in society that would be solved if everyone faithfully followed the Ten Commandments? Pretty comprehensive, isn't it? And it's a grace. I will also note that the penalty for each of these commandments, if you disobeyed any of these 10, you know what it was? Death. Death penalty, every one of them. Because if you violate one, as we're later taught, you violated them all. Oh, I'm a lawbreaker, accept that. No, you're a lawbreaker. And I told you I've worked with some recovered addicts who are like, I'm clean. I don't use meth anymore. Don't use cocaine. Sure, I still get drunk, and I smoke pot, and maybe do a couple other things. But it was a relative comparison, and we don't have a God that grades on the scale. Now, when we see this, we see that the only way to please God is to live a perfect life. Would anybody like to tell me their experience and how they managed to live a perfect life? No, not yet. So we were all subject to the penalty of death, are we not? And particularly when Jesus taught us that if you've thought hateful thoughts, you're a murderer. If you thought lustful thoughts, you're an adulterer. And so we all are subject to the penalty of death. So the only person, God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, comes down, lives a completely perfect, sinless life. And what is his reward for that? He was subject to the death penalty. That death penalty was for us. I heard of a church service where they were doing testimonies, and I'll close here shortly. And so one person would get up and tell some trials and recovery, and a man got up and he said, "I killed a man." And everybody was like, "Whoa!" And so one of the associate pastors was on the phone, was going to call the police. "We got a confession to a killer here." And he paused a little bit and he said, I nailed Jesus on the cross. And that sounds a little extreme and a little dramatic, but he did take our penalty. And so we are free, if we accept that, to be a new creature in Christ and to strive toward holiness, living by God's commands because he knows what's best for us as a loving, gracious Father. Sharing that with others. And when we are welcomed into heaven, we will be welcomed with the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And we want to live up to that, not by works, but by trust and obedience. Amen? Amen.